What crime is so terrible that an entire government would promise freedom to 2,000 men, parade them through the temples wearing victory garlands, and then make every single one of them vanish by morning? The year is 424 BC. In the heart of Sparta, a crowd gathers in the central square. 2,000 Helots stand shoulder to shoulder. They are smiling. Flowers crown their heads. For the first time in their lives, they are being cheered. These men are slaves, state property. They have spent their entire existence farming land they once owned, handing half of everything they grew to masters who never touched a plow. But today is different. Today, the Spartan government has announced that the bravest among them will be freed. The selection process was simple. Volunteer for the most dangerous missions, fight harder than any citizen, prove your courage, and earn your liberty. 2,000 men stepped forward. 2,000 men were chosen. Now they march around the sacred temples. Citizens line the streets. The sun is warm. The air smells of incense and roasted grain. For one afternoon, these men taste what freedom feels like. Then the sun goes down. By the next morning, all 2,000 are gone, not fled, not relocated, gone. No bodies float in the Eurotes River. No mass graves scar the hillsides outside the city walls. No blood stains the cobblestones. The historian Thucydides writes the only obituary these men will ever receive. The Spartans did away with them, he records, and no one ever knew how each of them perished. It was the perfect crime, a mass assassination so efficient it left no physical evidence, only a demographic void. Sparta did not just kill these men, it deleted them. But here is what Thucydides does not explain. Why would a government murder the very soldiers who fought hardest for it? Why would they design a promise of freedom as a death sentence? To understand why, we must go back 300 years. We must travel to a valley surrounded by mountains, where a decision was made that would doom two nations simultaneously. The geography of ancient Greece shaped everything. Every valley, every mountain pass, every stretch of coastline determined who thrived and who starved. And in the southeastern corner of the Peloponnese, two very different landscapes sat side by side. On one side lay Laconia, the Eurotas Valley, a hard land of jagged rocks and thin soil. The people who settled there learned to survive on little. They became tough. They became Spartans. But if you climbed the Taygetus Mountains and looked west, you saw something else entirely. You saw Messenia. In the ancient world, Messenia was paradise. The soil was deep and dark. The rains came predictably every season. The harvests were legendary. Greek poets called it the land of fine fruit. It was the breadbasket of the entire Peloponnese. To a hungry Spartan warlord standing on those mountain ridges around 740 BC, Messenia did not look like a neighbor. It looked like a banquet. Sparta made a choice. They could trade with Messenia, they could form alliances, they could build relationships that benefited both peoples. Instead, they chose to devour it. The First Messenian War was not a quick raid. It was a 20-year grinder, a relentless campaign of attrition that consumed an entire generation of young men on both sides. The Spartans did not simply want to defeat the Messenian army. They wanted to erase Messenian identity from the face of the earth. When the dust finally settled around 720 BC, Sparta did something unprecedented in Greek history. Usually, when a city-state won a war, they took some territory, demanded tribute payments, and went home. Sparta stayed. They annexed the entire country. Every olive grove, every vineyard, every inch of fertile ground became permanent property of the Spartan state. But land without hands to work, it is worthless. So they annexed the people too. The entire population of Messenia, tens of thousands of men, women, and children, was stripped of everything: their citizenship, their rights, their humanity. They were reclassified into a new category. They became Helots. This distinction matters. Ancient Greek slavery usually operated like a cattle market. individuals captured in foreign wars, transported to auction blocks, sold to whoever bid highest. A slave in Athens might come from Thrace or Syria or the coast of Anatolia. These people arrived alone, isolated, unable to speak the local language or understand the local customs. The Helots were different. They were enslaved on the very soil where their ancestors were buried. Imagine the weight of that reality. A Helot farmer would plow the same field his grandfather had owned as a free man. He would walk the same paths his father had walked. He would look up at the same mountains, breathe the same air, worship the same gods. But now, he owed half of everything he grew to a master who lived on the other side of those mountains. A master who had likely never held a farming tool in his life. The poet Tyrtaeus, who provided the soundtrack for this brutal occupation, described Helot existence with chilling precision. Like donkeys suffering under heavy loads, he wrote, by painful necessity they bring their masters half of all the fruit the cornland bears. The Spartans had swallowed a wolf, now they had to hold it down by the ears. The consequences exploded a few generations later. The Second Messenian War broke out in the mid-7th century BC. This was not a simple rebellion, it was a revolution. Led by a warrior named Aristomenes, who became legendary even if some historians doubt his existence. The Helots fought with the fury of people who had nothing left to lose. They used guerrilla tactics. They struck from the mountains. They turned Spartan aggression against itself. History often glosses over how close Sparta came to total collapse during this period. They were beaten in open battle, their morale shattered. They stood on the brink of retreating back to Laconia and abandoning their prize entirely. It took the fanatical poetry of Tyrtaeus and a complete militarization of their society to turn the tide. This near-death experience traumatized the Spartan psyche permanently. They realized a fundamental truth. Holding a wolf by the ears requires both hands. You cannot be farmers, you cannot be traders, you cannot be artists or philosophers. If you want to keep Messenia, you must become jailers, full-time, professional, lethal. This is the moment the Sparta of legend was born. The Messenian Wars were the catalyst for the Lycurgan reforms, that radical restructuring of society that created the agoge and the austere military lifestyle we recognize from movies and mythology. But it was not born from some noble ideal of perfection. It was reactive, defensive, desperate. They became warriors because they were sitting on a volcano. The conquest created a bizarre economic paradox. Sparta became the wealthiest state in Greece in terms of land and agricultural output, but its citizens could strictly own nothing. The wealth belonged to the system, and the system existed solely to support the military machine required to guard the wealth. It was a circular loop of violence. They needed the army to keep the Helots. They needed the Helots to feed the army, and the Helots were not just labor. They were the enemy. The Spartan state treated the Helot population as a conquered nation, requiring constant active suppression. They subjected them to a regime of terror that makes modern dictatorships look inefficient. The Spartans understood something dark about human psychology. To control a population that vastly outnumbered them, physical chains were not enough. You had to chain the mind. You had to institute a system where terror was as predictable as the seasons. This brings us to the most grotesque innovation of the Spartan state. It was not enough to beat the Helots in battle once. They had to beat them legally, religiously, and physically every single year. They created a ritual that turned murder into civic duty. In any other civilization, the inauguration of new leaders is a time for speeches about prosperity and unity and hope for the future. In Sparta, it was a time for a death sentence. Every autumn, 5 men known as the ephors took office. These were the overseers who held the real power in Sparta, even above the 2 kings. Their very first official act was a bizarre ritual. They would stand before the assembly and formally, legally, declare war on the Helots. This was not a metaphor. This was not a figure of speech. It was a binding resolution of state. Why would a government declare war on the people who grew its food and built its houses? The answer lies in the deep religious beliefs of the ancient Greeks. They were terrified of miasma, spiritual pollution, a kind of supernatural contamination that clung to anyone who committed murder. If a Spartan citizen killed a man during peacetime, he became tainted. He risked bringing the wrath of the gods down upon the entire city. Plagues, earthquakes, famine. The Spartans, being ruthlessly practical, found a loophole. In wartime, killing the enemy is not murder. It is a soldier's duty. By keeping the state in a perpetual legal state of war with the Helots, the ephors gave every Spartan citizen a blank check. They could strike down a Helot in the street, in the field, in his own home, and remain ritually pure. The legal fiction cleansed the conscience before the weapon was even drawn. This turned the entire territory of Laconia and Messenia into a free-fire zone. But physical violence was only half the equation. To control a population that so vastly outnumbered them, the Spartans knew they had to break the Helot spirit. They needed to make the Helots believe they deserved to be slaves. This required a campaign of psychological warfare that started from birth and never ended. The primary tool was ritual humiliation. The Spartans enforced a strict dress code designed to strip away human dignity. Helots were forbidden from wearing normal Greek clothing. Instead, they were forced to wear a kine, a cap made from dog skin. In the visual language of ancient Greece, this was devastating. The dog was seen as a lowly scavenging creature. By forcing Helots to wear the skin of a dog on their heads, the Spartans were visually marking them as subhuman, as creatures of a different, lower species. They also wore rough animal skins as cloaks. Even from a distance, they looked wild and unkempt compared to the groomed, red-cloaked Spartan citizens. According to the historian Plutarch, the humiliation went deeper than clothing. The Syssitia were the communal mess halls where Spartan men ate their daily meals. These dinners were the core of Spartan social life, places of discipline and brotherhood. But for entertainment, they would drag in Helots and force them to drink unmixed wine until they were violently drunk. In Greek culture, drinking wine without water was considered barbaric. It caused loss of control, stumbling, vomiting. The Spartans would force these intoxicated men to sing lewd songs and perform grotesque, formless dances. Then they would bring in their own children, the young boys undergoing training, and point to the wretched figures. "Look," they would say, "this is what it means to be a Helot. This is what it means to have no discipline. This is what you must never become." They used the Helots as living cautionary tales. The slave's degradation became the props for the master's education. This achieved two goals simultaneously. It reinforced the Spartan superiority complex, teaching the youth that they were a different breed of human, and it shattered the Helot's self-worth. If you are treated like a beast long enough, forced to dress like a beast, forced to act like a beast, you begin to believe you are one. Even the physical strength of the Helots was regulated. The Spartans needed strong workers to farm the land, but not too strong. If a Helot looked too fit, too intelligent, too capable, he was marked for death. According to some ancient sources, a master could actually be fined if his slaves became too well fed. It implied he was not working them hard enough. It was a biological tightrope. They bred the Helots for endurance, but they culled them for ambition. This system created a bizarre intimacy between master and slave. They lived side by side, yet they were separated by an ocean of blood and law. The Spartan relied on the Helot for everything: his bread, his wine, his armor, his legacy. Yet he had to wake up every morning ready to kill him. This constant state of hypervigilance transformed Sparta into a surveillance state, but they could not watch everyone all the time. The fields were vast. The mountains of Messenia were rugged. They needed eyes in the dark. They needed a force that could operate outside the law, beyond even the brutal norms of Spartan society. They needed a monster to catch a monster. And so, The agoge, that famous training system, produced its most terrifying graduates. Not the soldiers who stood in gleaming bronze on the battlefield, but the hunters who hid in the shadows. If the annual declaration of war provided the legal license to kill, the Krypteia provided the method. Popular culture depicts the agoge as a glorious boot camp where boys became men through wrestling and spear drills. We imagine a rigorous academy of honor. But if you strip away the myth, the agoge looks less like a military school and more like a cult of institutionalized abuse. Taken from their mothers at age 7, Spartan boys were starved, beaten, and forced to sleep on beds of reeds they picked themselves from the riverbanks. The goal was not just physical resilience. It was the complete eradication of empathy. The state needed soldiers who could watch a friend die without blinking, but more importantly, they needed overseers who could kill a slave without hesitation. The pinnacle of this indoctrination was not the phalanx, it was the Krypteia. The word comes from the Greek verb meaning to hide or to conceal. Modern historians often translate it as secret police or secret service, but a more accurate description might be state-sponsored death squad. It was the final, most terrifying stage of education for the Spartan elite. Only the best of the best were selected, the boys who showed the most promise and the most ruthlessness during their years in the agoge. The mission was simple and brutal. The young men, probably between the ages of 21 and 30, were sent out into the countryside, into the heart of Helot territory. They were given no armor, no shield, no spear. They carried only a short dagger and bare rations. During the day, they were invisible. They hid in the underbrush, slept in ditches or caves, watched the Helots work the fields. They observed. They took notes. Who was working the hardest? Who seemed to be organizing the others? Who looked the master in the eye a little too long? Then night fell. Under the cover of darkness, the Krypteia emerged. They did not strike at random. They struck with surgical precision. They descended upon the roads and the fields, hunting down the specific Helots they had marked during the day. The strongest, the bravest, the natural leaders. They slit their throats and vanished back into the shadows before dawn. Plutarch describes this not as warfare, but as culling. It inverted everything the Greeks held sacred about combat. Greek hoplite warfare was about standing shoulder to shoulder in the sunlight, fighting openly, dying with honor. The Krypteia was about hiding, stalking, murdering unarmed civilians in the dark. It taught the young Spartan leadership a crucial lesson. Honor applies only to your equals. For the enemy beneath you, there are no rules. This institution served a dual purpose. First, it terrorized the Helot population. The fear of the Krypteia meant that no Helot could ever feel safe, even in their own homes, even in their own beds. The knowledge that invisible eyes were watching them, waiting for any sign of defiance, shattered their ability to organize. If you stood out, you died. So the Helots learned to make themselves small, to hide their strength, to crush their own potential before the Spartans did it for them. Second, it was the ultimate final exam for the Spartan citizen. Before a man could take his place in the assembly or the battle line, he had to prove he had the stomach for the dirty work of the state. He had to bloody his hands. This created a ruling class bound together by complicity. Every full citizen of Sparta was, in effect, a veteran of a secret war against his own servants. Historians have long debated the scale of the Krypteia. Was it a rare ritual or a constant patrol? The sheer duration of Spartan dominance suggests the latter. You do not hold down a population of hundreds of thousands for centuries with just a few random murders. This was a systematic campaign of state terrorism. The agoge and the Krypteia turned Sparta into a fortress of flesh and bone. They believed they had created a perfect, immutable system. They had the laws, the training, the terror. They could maintain the status quo forever. But they forgot one thing. Systems built on tension are brittle. They can withstand pressure from one direction, but if the ground itself begins to move, the walls come crashing down. The Spartans prepared for war. They prepared for rebellion. But they were not prepared for the wrath of the earth itself. In 464 BC, the ground beneath the Eurotas Valley did not just shake, it liquefied. The Spartans, for all their military prowess, were deeply superstitious. They believed earthquakes were the footsteps of Poseidon, the earth shaker, and on this morning, Poseidon arrived with apocalyptic fury. The quake was catastrophic. Modern geologists studying the Sparta fault have determined that it was a major seismic event. Some ancient sources claim the death toll reached 20,000, though modern scholars suspect this number is exaggerated. In seconds, the grand but unfortified villages that made up the city of Sparta crumbled. The gymnasium, where hundreds of young men and boys were training, collapsed. It buried the flower of their youth under tons of stone. The invincible city was reduced to a heap of rubble and screaming survivors. In any other city, the immediate reaction would be to dig for survivors, to weep, to panic. But King Archidamus, one of the two rulers of Sparta, had a different instinct. Standing amidst the dust clouds, looking at the devastation around him, he realized something terrifying. The walls of the prison had fallen down, the guards were dead, and the prisoners were watching. He did not order a rescue mission. He ordered the trumpeters to sound the call to arms. It was a stroke of cold, paranoid genius. Archidamus knew that the Helots in the surrounding fields would see the dust rising. He knew they would interpret this not as a tragedy, but as a divine signal to attack. And he was right. As the surviving Spartans scrambled to grab their shields and form a ragged phalanx in the ruins, armed bands of Helots were already rushing toward the city. They hoped to finish what the earthquake had started. They arrived to find the Spartans ready, standing in formation over the bodies of their own children. The surprise attack failed, but the war had just begun. This triggered the Great Helot Revolt, a conflict that would bleed Sparta for an entire decade. The rebels, realizing they could not take the city directly, retreated to the fastness of Mount Ithome in Messenia. This was a place of deep significance, a symbol of Messenian resistance going back centuries. They turned the mountain into a fortress. It was a humiliating stalemate. The greatest siege experts in Greece could not dislodge a group of runaway slaves. Year after year, the Spartans threw themselves against those walls. Year after year, they failed. Desperate, humiliated, running out of manpower, the Spartans did the unthinkable. They asked for help. They sent an appeal to their rivals, the Athenians. Athens, led by a statesman named Cimon who favored cooperation with Sparta, responded with generosity. They marched 4,000 heavy infantry into Laconia to assist their brother Greeks in suppressing the slave rebellion. It was a fatal mistake. When the Athenians arrived, the culture shock was immediate. These were men from a democracy, loud, questioning, innovative, free. They looked at the Helots on Mount Ithome fighting for their liberty. Then they looked at the Spartans fighting to re-enslave them. The Spartans watched the Athenians interacting with the locals, and panic set in. The Spartan leadership began to fear that the Athenians would switch sides. They feared the revolutionary spirit of democracy was contagious, a virus that might infect the minds of their remaining slaves. So, in a move of stunning diplomatic incompetence, Sparta fired them. They told the 4,000 Athenian soldiers who had marched all that way to help that their services were no longer required. They sent them home while keeping allies from other cities. The insult was calculated and public. Athens was outraged. The rejection shattered the alliance between the two powers and paved the road directly to the Peloponnesian War that would tear Greece apart for decades. But it revealed the core truth of the Spartan condition. They would rather risk losing a war than risk exposing their society to the dangerous idea of freedom. The earthquake of 464 BC did not destroy Sparta, but it broke the illusion of their invincibility. It proved that the Helots were not broken animals. They were a coiled spring, waiting for the slightest crack in the armor to snap back. And as Sparta spent the next 10 years trying to drag rebels down from a mountain, the demographic clock was ticking. The earthquake had killed too many pure-blooded Spartans. The population was shrinking. Yet despite this glaring weakness, the myth of Spartan supremacy persisted. Why? Because of a single battle that happened a generation earlier, a battle that was spun by propaganda to look like a victory for Spartan arms, when in reality, it was built on the backs of the very people they oppressed. We need to talk about Thermopylae. You know the image. It is burned into our cultural memory. King Leonidas standing defiant at the hot gates, 300 perfect physical specimens, their red cloaks billowing in the wind, forming an impenetrable wall of bronze against the Persian millions. It is the ultimate story of self-sacrifice. The story that tells us this is what free men can do. But there is a ghost in the frame. If you zoom out from the close-ups of the heroes, you begin to see the blurry figures in the background, the figures carrying the heavy supplies, the figures cooking the food, the figures tending to the wounds. And yes, the figures holding spears of their own. We need to talk about the math of the Spartan war machine. The ancient historian Herodotus, our primary source for these wars, drops a statistic about the Battle of Plataea, fought just 1 year after Thermopylae. That is absolutely staggering. He records that for every single Spartan citizen soldier on the battlefield, there were 7 Helots. 7. Think about that ratio, 1 to 7. That means if a Spartan army of 5,000 marched out, they were accompanied by 35,000 slaves. This was not a squad. It was a moving city of masters and servants. The Spartans were the officers and the heavy shock troops, but the Helots were the logistics, the infrastructure, the light infantry who threw stones and javelins to harass the enemy flanks. So when we look back at the Battle of Thermopylae, we have to ask, where were the Helots? They were there. They had to be. A Spartan hoplite carried about 70 pounds of bronze and wood. He did not carry his own rations, his bedding, his tent. A Helot attendant did all of that. When Leonidas marched his 300 to the pass, he likely marched with hundreds of Helots in tow. Some ancient sources suggest as many as 900. When the Persians attacked, the Helots were not just watching, they were dying. The arrows that rained down from the sky did not discriminate between a free man and a slave. Herodotus himself mentions that when the Persian king Xerxes displayed the Greek dead, Helots were among the bodies shown to his troops. He records that 4,000 Greeks fell at Thermopylae, and this number included not only the 300 Spartans and 700 Thespians, but also many Helots. Yet when we recite the epitaph of Thermopylae, that famous inscription carved in stone, we only honor the citizens. Go tell the Spartans, stranger passing by, that here, obedient to their laws, we lie. There is no monument for the slaves who were forced to die for laws that kept them in chains. This reveals the brilliant propaganda victory of Sparta. They managed to curate their own history in real time. By focusing the world's attention on the elite peers, they erased the massive workforce that made their heroism possible. It is like watching a car race and thinking the driver built the vehicle, changed the tires, and filled the fuel tank all by himself. The presence of the Helots at these battles adds a dark layer of irony to the Spartan last stand. Why did the Spartans fight to the death? Was it purely honor, or was it also fear? Remember the ratio? If a Spartan turned and ran, he was not just showing cowardice to his enemy, he was showing weakness to his slaves. If the Helots saw their masters break, the illusion of Spartan invincibility would shatter. They had to maintain the performance of the superhuman soldier at all costs. Because the moment they looked human, the 35,000 men standing behind them might decide to stab them in the back instead of the Persians. This reliance on a massive slave army eventually poisoned the Spartan military from the inside. They became paralyzed. They could not deploy their forces effectively because they were terrified of arming the Helots, yet they could not wage war without them. And as the centuries ground on, the simple math of biology began to catch up with them. The Spartan obsession with purity and culling, the very things they thought made them strong, these began to bleed them dry. The 300 was not just a number at a battle, it was a prophecy of their future population. They were running out of men. While the world trembled at the sight of the Spartan phalanx, Aristotle, the great philosopher who observed Sparta closely, diagnosed the state with a fatal disease. He called it oliganthropy. The literal translation is shortage of human beings, but in the Spartan context, it meant something more specific: the death of citizens. The numbers paint a picture of slow-motion suicide. In 480 BC, at the height of the Persian Wars, Sparta could field approximately 8,000 full citizens. These were the elite peers, the homoioi, the equals. By the time we reached the Battle of Leuctra in 371 BC, just over a century later, that number had plummeted to fewer than 1,000. How does a society obsessed with breeding strong warriors lose 90% of its manpower without suffering a catastrophic plague or genocide? The answer lies in their own rigid laws. The Spartan system was designed to be an exclusive club, but the entry fees became too high for its own members to pay. To remain a citizen, a Spartan man had to contribute a specific quota of barley, wine, oil, and figs to the Syssitia every single month. This food came from his kleros, the plot of land worked by his Helots. If his land did not produce enough, if his Helots died, if his estate was divided among too many sons, he could not pay his dues. And here is the ruthless consequence. If you could not pay, you were expelled from the club, you lost your citizenship, you became an inferior. You were still Spartan by blood, but you could no longer vote, you could no longer hold office, you could no longer serve in the elite units. You were socially dead. As wealth concentrated in fewer and fewer hands, more men fell off the ladder. The rich Spartans and, famously, Spartan women who could inherit and own land amassed huge estates while the poorer families slipped into oblivion. Aristotle noted with shock that by his time 2/5 of all land in Sparta was owned by women. This created a wealthy aristocracy while the military class evaporated. This created a terrifying strategic nightmare. Remember the ratio of terror? In 480 BC, the Spartans were outnumbered by the Helots, perhaps 7-1, by 370 BC. As the citizen population crashed, that ratio might have ballooned to 20-1, or worse. The Spartan leadership was paralyzed. They had a massive empire of slaves to control, but a tiny police force to do it. They became fiercely protective of their remaining citizens, terrified of suffering even minor casualties in battle. The ferocious lions of Greece turned into cautious hoarders, refusing to commit troops to foreign campaigns because losing even 50 Spartans was a national tragedy. Spartan decline was not caused by softness or luxury, it was caused by math. The system ate itself. They were so obsessed with maintaining the quality of their citizens that they forgot that quantity has a quality all its own. They were running a skeleton crew on a sinking ship, desperately patching leaks while the water rose around their ankles. And while the men of Sparta were busy policing their own decline, the soul of the city began to rot. A society that spends 100% of its energy on surveillance and suppression has no energy left for anything else. No art, no philosophy, no progress. Just silence. Walk through Athens today and you can still touch the marble columns of the Parthenon. You can stand in the theater where Sophocles premiered Oedipus Rex. You can walk the grounds of the academy where Plato taught. The physical legacy of Athenian democracy is undeniable. Now go to Sparta. What will you find? Almost nothing. A few low foundations, an olive grove, a Roman-era theater built long after the Spartans were irrelevant. The ancient historian Thucydides predicted this exact scenario over 2,400 years ago. He wrote that if the city of Sparta were ever deserted, future generations would never believe it had been a great power because it possessed no temples or monuments of note. Why? Why did the most powerful state in Greece leave behind a cultural void? The answer brings us back to the Helots. Cultural stagnation was the price Sparta paid for its security. Creativity requires freedom. It requires an open mind, the exchange of ideas, the leisure to dream. But the Spartan mind was not free. It was occupied territory. When you live in a police state, even if you are the police, your imagination is in chains. The Spartans were so terrified of dangerous ideas infecting their slave population that they banned them for themselves too. They practiced xenolasia, the expulsion of foreigners. While Athens welcomed thinkers, merchants, and artists from all over the known world, Sparta locked its gates. They feared that a traveling merchant might whisper a word about democracy or revolution to a Helot, or worse, to a young Spartan. So they shut out the world. They banned gold and silver coinage. Instead, they used heavy, useless iron spits as currency. This made trade practically impossible. No trade meant no foreign ships, no exotic goods, no new stories. They froze their culture in a block of ice to preserve their control. The psychological toll on the individual Spartan was immense. We often imagine the master as the one with the power, but in Sparta, the master was a slave to the system he created. A Spartan citizen could not travel abroad without permission. He could not farm his own land. He could not engage in business. He could not even dine with his wife. He had to eat porridge with his platoon until he was 60 years old. His entire life was a performance of toughness. He had to suppress every natural human instinct: pity, greed, curiosity, fear. Because showing emotion was a crack in the armor. If he relaxed, the Helots might notice. If he laughed too loud, the Helots might lose respect. This creates a society of profound anxiety. It is the psychology of the prison guard who lives inside the prison. He has the keys, yes, but he breathes the same stale air as the inmates. He can never truly sleep. The Spartans produced no great playwrights because drama requires empathy, the ability to see the world through another person's eyes. A Spartan was trained from age 7 not to empathize, especially not with the lower classes. They produced no great philosophers because philosophy requires questioning the status quo. In Sparta, questioning the laws of Lycurgus was treason. They were trapped in a loop of their own making. They sacrificed their art, their architecture, their intellectual growth, all of it burned on the altar of military dominance. They became the best soldiers in the world, but they forgot what they were fighting for. They were fighting simply to maintain the ability to fight. And like all static systems in a dynamic world, they became obsolete. While the rest of Greece was evolving, developing new tactics, new economies, new alliances, Sparta stood still, clutching its spear, staring at its slaves. The end, when it finally came, arrived not from the Persians or the Athenians, but from a neighbor who had watched them, studied them, and figured out exactly how to break them. By 371 BC, the rest of Greece had tired of Spartan bullying. But fear is a powerful adhesive. The reputation of the Spartan army still held the world in check. It took a man from Thebes to realize that the Spartan dragon was old, toothless, and guarding an empty cave. His name was Epaminondas. He is one of the most underrated figures in ancient history, a philosopher general who did not just want to defeat Sparta, he wanted to dismantle it. When the two armies met on the dusty plains of Leuctra, the Spartans expected the usual script. They lined up in their traditional phalanx, placing their best troops, the king and his elite guard, on the right wing, as they had done for 300 years. Epaminondas threw the script in the fire. Instead of matching the Spartan line evenly, He packed his left wing 50 men deep, facing the Spartan elites. He refused to engage the rest of the enemy line, creating what military historians call an oblique order. When the crash came, it was not a battle, it was a physics equation. The massive weight of the Theban column smashed through the thin Spartan line like a hammer through glass. In one afternoon, 400 of the 700 full Spartan citizens present were killed. The king himself fell on the field. The invincibility of Sparta died with him. But Epaminondas knew that winning a battle was not enough. Sparta had lost battles before. To kill the beast, he had to cut off its food supply. He had to go to the source. That winter, he did something no army had dared to do in centuries. He marched straight into the Peloponnese. He bypassed Sparta itself. The city was defenseless. Women and children wept in the streets, expecting slaughter. But Epaminondas ignored them. He was not interested in burning villages. He was interested in burning the system. He marched his army over the Taygetus Mountains and into Messenia. For the first time in nearly 400 years, an army stood on that soil not to conquer, but to liberate. Epaminondas called the Helots to him. He told them they were no longer slaves. He told them they were citizens of a new free state. He did not just give speeches, he laid bricks. In a matter of months, with the help of international engineers and the labor of thousands of newly freed Helots, he built a massive fortified city called Messene. Its walls were some of the strongest in Greece, designed specifically to withstand Spartan aggression. He also founded Megalopolis, meaning the great city, to the north, creating a ring of steel around Sparta. The psychological impact was nuclear. The Helots, who had been treated as subhuman beasts of burden, suddenly had a capital, a government, an army of their own. The stolen land was returned. The effect on Sparta was immediate and catastrophic. Without the fertile fields of Messenia, the Spartan economy evaporated. Without the Helot labor force, the Spartan citizens had no one to farm their kleros. The peers could no longer pay their mess dues. The social structure collapsed. Sparta did not disappear. It did not burn to the ground. It simply shrank. It became a second-rate power, a grumpy, irrelevant town in the middle of nowhere. They kept their strange laws and their brutal training, but without the economic engine of slavery, it was just theater. They became a living museum. In later centuries, wealthy Roman tourists would actually visit Sparta to watch the boys get whipped at the altar of Artemis. They tossed coins to the performers like they were watching a freak show. The irony is absolute. The society that obsessed over power above all else ended up powerless. The society that tried to freeze time was ultimately crushed by the march of progress. And the people they tried to erase, the Helots, outlived them. So here we are. We have walked through the valley of the Eurotas. We have seen the massacres, the whips, the secret police, the slow, agonizing suicide of a superpower. Yet if you walk into a gym today, you will see t-shirts emblazoned with Spartan helmets. If you turn on the television, you might hear politicians quoting Leonidas. Video games, movies, and comic books continue to sell us the fantasy of the super soldier. Scholars call this phenomenon the Spartan mirage. It is a historical optical illusion that has seduced thinkers for millennia, from Plato to Rousseau and, yes, even to the architects of some of history's darkest regimes. Why? Because from a distance, Sparta looks like a masterpiece of order. It offers a seductive promise that if we just strip away the messiness of democracy, the noise of debate, the softness of luxury, we can become pure, we can become strong. But history is not a statue to be admired from afar. You have to get close. And when you get close to Sparta, you smell the blood. The tragedy of Sparta is not that they died. All civilizations die. The tragedy is how they lived. They built a society dedicated entirely to the preservation of the state, but in the process, They destroyed the lives of the people in the state. They achieved stability, but it was the stability of a graveyard. By enslaving the Helots, the Spartans enslaved themselves. They locked themselves in a cage of fear. They could not travel. They could not write. They could not change. While Athens gave the world democracy, theater, and logic, tools that we still use to liberate our minds today, Sparta gave us the word laconic and a cautionary tale about the dangers of extremism. The Helots, on the other hand, represent something far more powerful than military discipline. They represent the indomitable human need for dignity. Despite centuries of systematic dehumanization, being hunted like animals, dressed in dog skin, massacred for sport, they never broke. They kept their culture alive in the dark. They waited. And when the walls cracked, they reclaimed their world. There is a profound lesson here. We often mistake hardness for strength. We confuse the capacity for violence with the capacity for survival. But Sparta proves that true resilience is not about how rigid your shield is. It is about how flexible your society can be. A system that cannot bend, that cannot integrate new people and new ideas, is destined to shatter. The 300 Spartans at the Hot Gates deserve their place in history for their physical courage. But the thousands of nameless Helots who stood behind them, and the millions who suffered under them, they deserve our attention for their endurance. The next time you see that crimson cloak on a screen or hear a speech about the glory of the 300, remember the shadow behind the shield. Remember the price of that perfection. Ask yourself which you would rather be: a citizen of a state that is feared by everyone, or a citizen of a state that is free? That question still echoes through the ruins of the Eurotas Valley. And in Mycenae today, the walls Epaminondas built still stand. Wildflowers grow between the ancient stones. The descendants of the Helots walk those streets as free people. The tyrants are dust, but the spring keeps returning.